Picture this. You're trained to protect others, equipped with the knowledge to recognize danger, and sworn to serve justice. But what happens when the very system you trust fails you in your moment of greatest need? This is the haunting reality that Detective Tanisha Pughsley faced in the summer of 2020. At just 27 years old, she was a rising star in the Montgomery Police Department, a woman who had dedicated her life to keeping others safe. Yet, when she needed protection most, all her training, all her experience, and even a court-ordered protection order weren't enough to save her life.
First of all, it's an honor. This is the place where my daughter volunteered, a place that she loved, and you can just feel the love here. Domestic violence.
On a sweltering July morning in Montgomery, Alabama, the unthinkable happened. Detective Pughsley was found dead in her own home, killed by the very person she had fought so hard to escape. Her ex-boyfriend, Brandon Webster, had shattered every boundary, violated every legal protection, and destroyed a life that held so much promise. But here's what makes this case so devastating. Tanisha had done everything right. She had followed every protocol she would have advised any victim to follow. She had obtained that protective order. She had documented the abuse. She had taken every precaution that should have kept her safe, so why wasn't it enough? And what does this tell us about the gaps in our system that can prove fatal, even for those trained to navigate them? The answers to these questions reveal uncomfortable truths about domestic violence, protection orders, and the unique vulnerabilities faced by those in law enforcement. Growing up in the bustling streets of Chicago, Tanisha Pughsley, affectionately known as Tookie to those closest to her, was shaped by two powerful forces: the urban realities surrounding her and the unwavering guidance of her mother, Dr. Sharon Pughsley. Dr. Pughsley didn't just raise a daughter, she cultivated a future leader. From an early age, Tanisha was immersed in conversations about justice, education, and the responsibility we all have to lift up those around us. These weren't abstract concepts in the Pughsley household. They were lived values that would define Tanisha's path. But Tanisha wasn't content to simply talk about making a difference. In high school, she was already demonstrating the kind of leadership that would later define her career. Her brother, Dandre Jenkins, often recalled how his sister had this innate ability to see what needed to be done and then actually do it, no matter how challenging. When college time came, Tanisha made a pivotal decision that would set the course for her future. She chose Alabama State University, drawn to their criminal justice program and the opportunity to turn her passion for helping others into a career. But even there, Tanisha stood out from her peers. She didn't just study criminal justice, she lived it. While balancing her academic workload, she found time to excel as a member of the university's bowling team, demonstrating that same precision and focus that would later make her such an effective detective. Her professors remember her as the student who would stay after class, diving deep into discussions about police reform, community relations, and the kind of law enforcement officer she wanted to become. What made Tanisha special wasn't just her academic excellence. It was her understanding that true justice comes from connection, not just enforcement. She was already envisioning a different kind of policing, one built on trust and community engagement rather than fear and authority. After graduation, Tanisha continued her education, earning a master's degree in public administration from Auburn University at Montgomery, further equipping herself with the tools she'd need to create real change in law enforcement. In 2016, when she joined the Montgomery Police Department, Tanisha brought more than just training and education. She brought a vision of what policing could be. And from day one, it was clear that this young detective was going to be something special. But success in law enforcement can sometimes make us targets in ways we never expect. And for Tanisha, the very qualities that made her such an effective officer, her compassion, her trust in the system, her belief that doing the right thing would lead to the right outcomes, would also make her vulnerable in ways she never could have anticipated. Within the Montgomery Police Department, Detective Tanisha Pughsley quickly earned a reputation that extended far beyond her solve rates and case clearances. She was the officer who remembered names, who followed up on victims weeks after their cases were closed, who showed up to community events on her days off. Her colleagues watched in amazement as Tanisha transformed routine police work into genuine community building. When she worked a domestic violence case, she didn't just file the paperwork and move on. She connected victims with resources, checked in on their safety, and became a lifeline for families navigating their darkest moments. But Tanisha's impact reached far beyond her badge. Through her volunteer work with Transformation Montgomery, she was actively helping families secure affordable housing and providing life skills training to those who needed it most. At the Sequel Group home, she became a mentor to young girls who saw in her everything they could become. Perhaps most tellingly, Tanisha used her growing social media presence to educate women about personal safety. She regularly shared tips about self-defense, encouraged women to take firearms training, and emphasized the importance of trusting their instincts when relationships felt wrong. She was creating the kind of content that could save lives. The irony is heartbreaking when you think about it. Here was a woman who spent her days helping other women recognize and escape dangerous situations, yet she was walking deeper into one herself. Because sometime during this period of professional success and community impact, Tanisha met Brandon Webster. And initially there was nothing that set off alarm bells. He was 24, charming enough, and seemed genuinely interested in the accomplished detective who was making such a difference in Montgomery. Their relationship progressed naturally, or so it seemed. They began spending more time together, eventually sharing a living space. For someone as busy and dedicated as Tanisha, having a partner who understood her demanding schedule and community commitments probably felt like a blessing. But here's what makes domestic abuse so insidious, especially for strong, intelligent women like Tanisha. It doesn't announce itself with dramatic red flags. It starts small. A comment about her schedule, a suggestion that she's spending too much time at work, questions about who she's been talking to. For someone trained to recognize these patterns in others, it's almost unthinkable that they wouldn't see them in their own life. But that's exactly what makes this case so tragic and so important for us to understand. Because if it could happen to Detective Tanisha Puesley, a woman who investigated domestic violence cases, who educated others about relationship red flags, who had every resource and training available, then it can happen to anyone. The question that haunts this case is, when did things begin to change? When did the man Tanisha trusted become the man she needed protection from? The transformation didn't happen overnight. Domestic abuse rarely does. It's a gradual erosion of boundaries, a slow-motion destruction of the victim's sense of safety and autonomy. And Brandon Webster appeared to follow this playbook with calculated precision. At first, his behavior might have seemed like concern. Questions about where Tanisha had been, who she'd been talking to, why she was working late again. For someone in law enforcement, where unpredictable schedules and community obligations are part of the job, these could have seemed like normal relationship conversations. But concern became control. Control became intimidation, and intimidation became violence. The first physical incident was particularly telling in its cruelty. Webster struck Tanisha twice in the head while she was holding a 5-month-old baby, her godchild. The attack was so sudden and forceful that Tanisha nearly dropped the infant, turning what should have been a moment of joy into a terrifying reminder of Webster's capacity for violence. Think about the psychology of that moment. Webster didn't just assault Tanisha, he endangered an innocent child in the process. It was a calculated move designed to show her that his anger had no limits, no boundaries that he wouldn't cross. But the physical abuse was just one element of Webster's campaign of control. He began systematically stealing Tanisha's personal belongings, creating a constant state of instability in her own home. Items would disappear, then sometimes reappear, keeping her off balance and questioning her own memory. The harassment escalated to a relentless digital assault. Text messages at all hours, phone calls that wouldn't stop, and when Tanisha didn't respond quickly enough, Webster would appear at her workplace or her home, demonstrating that he could reach her anywhere, anytime. For a detective who understood criminal behavior, these tactics were particularly insidious. Webster was essentially conducting psychological warfare, using techniques that law enforcement recognizes as stalking and intimidation. Yet experiencing them personally, even for someone with Tanisha's training, created a different kind of terror. The most dangerous period in any abusive relationship is when the victim tries to leave. And by early 2020, Tanisha had reached that breaking point. She knew she needed to get out, and she knew she needed legal protection to do it safely. So she did what she would have advised any victim to do. She went to court. On May 22, 2020, Detective Tanisha Puesley filed for a protection order against Brandon Webster. Her petition was thorough, professional, and devastating in its details. She documented the physical assaults, the theft, the harassment, and the increasingly threatening behavior that made her fear for her life. But she also made one specific request that would prove to be tragically crucial. She asked the court to order Webster to surrender his firearms. The question is, would the court listen? And would a piece of paper be enough to stop a man who had already shown he respects no boundaries? When Detective Tanisha Puesley walked into that Montgomery County courtroom to request protection, she carried with her not just documentation of abuse, but the hopes that the legal system she served would protect her in return. She had done everything by the book, gathered evidence, documented incidents, followed every protocol she would have advised any victim to follow. The court reviewed her petition carefully. The evidence was overwhelming. Repeated physical assaults, documented theft of personal property, a pattern of harassment and intimidation that painted a clear picture of escalating danger. This wasn't a case of he said, she said. This was a law enforcement officer presenting a methodical, professional case for her own protection. On June 19, 2020, the court granted most of Tanisha's requests. Webster was ordered to cease all contact, to stay away from her home and workplace, and to stop the harassment that had made her life unbearable. It was a comprehensive protection order that should have given her the breathing room she needed to rebuild her sense of safety. But there was one crucial omission, one that would prove fatal. The court did not order Brandon Webster to surrender his firearms. Let that sink in for a moment. Here was a man with a documented history of violence against a law enforcement officer, a man who had shown complete disregard for boundaries and legal authority, and he was allowed to keep his weapons. In particular, he retained access to an AR-style rifle, a weapon designed for maximum lethality. Research consistently shows that domestic violence becomes exponentially more dangerous when firearms are present. The presence of a gun in a domestic violence situation increases the risk of homicide by 500%. For someone like Tanisha, who understood these statistics professionally, the court's decision must have been terrifying. But what could she do? She had followed the system, trusted the process, and received what protection the law was willing to provide. All she could do now was hope that the piece of paper would be enough to keep Webster away. For a few weeks it seemed like it might work. Tanisha returned to her life with the protection order in place, taking reasonable precautions, but trying to maintain some sense of normalcy. She continued her work at the police department, her community involvement, her efforts to help other women recognize and escape dangerous relationships. But Brandon Webster had never shown respect for boundaries, legal authority, or Tanisha's autonomy. Why would a court order change that now? The protection order wasn't a shield, it was just paper, and paper can't stop bullets. As July 2020 approached, Webster's behavior suggested that far from being deterred by the legal consequences, he was becoming more desperate, more dangerous. The protection order hadn't eliminated the threat, it had simply pushed it underground, where it festered and grew more lethal. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test whether our legal system's protections are anything more than an illusion of safety. July 5, 2020, was a Sunday evening like many others in Montgomery. Detective Tanisha Puesley was at her home on Overview Drive in the Quiet Park Lake neighborhood, spending time with a friend. After weeks of living under the stress of the protection order situation, having company felt both natural and smart, safety in numbers, as any law enforcement officer would know. The evening passed peacefully. Two people sharing conversation, maybe watching television, creating the kind of normal domestic scene that Tanisha had been hoping to reclaim since getting the protection order. For a few hours, life felt manageable again. But at 2:15 in the morning on July the 6th, that peace was shattered forever. Brandon Webster arrived at Tanisha's home armed with an AR-style rifle and a complete disregard for the legal order that was supposed to keep him away. He didn't knock. He didn't call. He forced his way into her residence, violating not just the protection order, but Tanisha's most basic right to safety in her own home. Imagine the terror of that moment. You're sleeping in your own bed, in a home you've tried to secure, under the protection of a court order, and suddenly your worst nightmare materializes in your living space, armed with a weapon designed to kill. The friend who was with Tanisha that night found themselves thrust into a life-or-death situation they never could have anticipated. When Webster confronted them both, this witness made the split-second decision to try to disarm him, creating a physical struggle over control of the rifle. In those chaotic moments, as three people fought over a weapon in the confined space of Tanisha's home, everything balanced on a knife's edge. The witness managed to break away from the struggle and make a desperate escape, running from the house to get help, leaving Tanisha alone with the man who had already demonstrated his willingness to use violence against her. Tanisha Puesley found herself facing the ultimate test of survival in her own home. She had done everything right. She had followed every protocol. She had trusted the system she served. But in the end, none of it was enough to stop a man with a gun and the willingness to use it. When Montgomery police officers arrived at the scene, responding to the witness's desperate call for help, they found their colleague and friend had been shot in the chest. Despite their rapid response and immediate medical attention, Detective Tanisha Puesley was pronounced dead at the scene. The woman who had dedicated her life to protecting others had been murdered in her own home by the very person the legal system should have stopped. In the immediate aftermath of Detective Puesley's murder, Montgomery erupted into action. This wasn't just another domestic violence case, this was the killing of one of their own, a respected officer who had been failed by the very system she had served. The Montgomery Police Department immediately activated their Officer Down protocols. Within hours, black mourning wreaths appeared on the doors of MPD headquarters. Mayor Stephen Reed ordered flags lowered to half-staff throughout the city. But most importantly, every available resource was mobilized to find Brandon Webster. He had fled the scene after shooting Tanisha, but in today's connected world, disappearing isn't as easy as it once was. The U.S. Marshals Fugitive Task Force joined the manhunt, bringing federal resources and expertise to bear on tracking down a man who had just committed one of the most heinous crimes imaginable. Webster's capture came swiftly. Within days, federal marshals had located and arrested him, ensuring he couldn't harm anyone else or flee the jurisdiction. The charges he faced reflected the severity of his actions. 2 counts of capital murder, one for committing the act during a burglary, another for violating the protection order, plus attempted murder for his actions toward the witness. When Webster appeared in court, he was held without bond on the capital murder charges, with additional bond set at $150,000 for the attempted murder charge. The message was clear. This was a defendant who posed an extreme danger to public safety. But while the legal system moved into action, the Montgomery community was grappling with a more fundamental question. How had this happened? How had a detective who understood the dangers, who had taken all the proper precautions, who had followed every protocol, ended up murdered by the very person she had sought protection from? On July 10, 2020, over 100 MPD officers, community members and family gathered for a candlelight vigil to honor Tanisha's life and service. It was a moment of collective grief, but also collective determination that her death would not be in vain. Dr. Sharon Puesley, speaking through her devastation, made a promise that night that would reshape how Montgomery, and eventually communities across the country, think about domestic violence prevention. Her daughter's death would become a catalyst for change, a rallying cry for better protections, and a legacy that would continue saving lives. But first, there was the matter of justice. Brandon Webster would face trial for his crimes, and the community would get its day in court. The question was, Would the verdict bring the kind of closure that could help heal a community's wounds? The wheels of justice turned slowly, and for Dr. Sharon Pusley and the Montgomery community, the wait for Brandon Webster's trial felt endless. For 3 long years, while Webster sat in jail awaiting his day in court, Tanisha's family and colleagues had to live with the knowledge that her killer had not yet been held fully accountable for his crimes. Finally, in August 2023, Brandon Webster's trial began. The courthouse was packed with law enforcement officers, community members, and family who had waited years to see justice served. The prosecution faced the challenging task of reconstructing that horrific night while honoring Tanisha's memory and ensuring that Webster faced the full consequences of his actions. The case was in many ways straightforward. The evidence was overwhelming. Webster had violated a protection order, forced his way into Tanisha's home, and murdered her with an assault weapon. The surviving witness provided first-hand testimony about the struggle for the rifle and Webster's actions that night. But the defense team attempted to muddy the waters, looking for any angle that might spare Webster from the ultimate penalty. They couldn't dispute the basic facts: Webster had killed Tanisha, but they could try to argue about his state of mind, the circumstances, anything that might create reasonable doubt about the capital murder charges. The prosecution, however, had built an airtight case. They presented evidence of Webster's pattern of escalating violence, his deliberate choice to arm himself with an assault weapon, his conscious decision to violate the protection order, and his premeditated actions that night. In August 2023, after years of waiting, the jury reached their verdict. Brandon Webster was found guilty on all charges. 2 counts of capital murder, one for the burglary, another for violating the protection order, plus first-degree attempted assault for his actions toward the witness. The sentencing was swift and decisive: life in prison without the possibility of parole for the capital murder convictions, plus an additional 10 years for the attempted assault. Webster, now 27 years old, the same age Tanisha was when he killed her, would spend the rest of his life behind bars. But for Dr. Sharon Pusley, the verdict was just the beginning. Justice in the courtroom couldn't bring her daughter back, couldn't undo the systemic failures that had made Tanisha's murder possible, couldn't protect other women facing similar dangers. Real justice, she understood, would come from ensuring that no other family had to endure what hers had suffered. It would come from fixing the gaps in the system that had failed her daughter. It would come from turning Tanisha's death into a force for life-saving change. And so, even as Webster was led away to begin his life sentence, Dr. Pusley was already planning the next phase of her mission: creating Tuki's Voice, a non-profit organization dedicated to supporting domestic violence victims and advocating for stronger protective measures. The legal case was closed, but Tanisha's real legacy was just beginning.